live streamed transmission from the House of Sweden of one of our events. It's on YouTube as we speak. We have the great honor to have with us today actually all of the 9 Americans who have received the Nobel Prize this year. And we have these distinguished gentlemen right next to us here. For chemistry, Dr. Martin Karplus, Dr. Michael Levitt, and Dr. Arieh Warshel. In medicine, Dr. James Rothman, Dr. Randy Schekman, and Dr. Thomas Südhof. And in economics, Dr. Eugene Fama, Dr. Lars Peter Hansen, and Dr. Robert Shiller. Congratulations to all of you. It's a great honor for us to have you here. I think we'll give them all a big round of applause. It's become a tradition to organize this day in Washington, D.C., when the President of the United States is inviting the laureates of the Nobel Prize from the United States. And we've just actually come from that meeting at the White House, and I can testify that the laureates were duly celebrated by the President in a very warm and pleasant meeting, and it's really a pleasure to see you now here in the House of Sweden. We, here at the Embassy, in our turn, we try to organize this seminar, and in addition to that, also a gala dinner at the residence, an event that we co-host together with Ambassador of Norway, my friend Kåre Aas. You are here on the first row. And the idea is to actually gather the laureates early on to allow for the laureates themselves and their families to get together and to meet each other, to learn a little bit more what they could expect from their stay and the festivities in Stockholm. So I think this is sort of a dress rehearsal for you. You will have the same kind of experience when you get to Stockholm, but many times around, and the questions that we will pose to you will be probably repeated over and over again when you get to see our media and our people and our friends in Stockholm as well. The discussion here is set up in that way that those of us who are not experts in your fields of excellence can learn a bit about the work of the laureates in layman's terms. And it gives you also an opportunity to tell us a little bit about your achievements and how they could impact society. Science, research and innovation, economics are all areas of high importance to Sweden. And a large part of our economy is dependent on international trade and exchange. That's why our country invests about 3.5% of our GDP in research and development. And this makes Sweden one of the most research-intense nations in the world. But the United States still holds the title of the greatest science nation on earth. And it is the nation with the most Nobel laureates. As a matter of fact, with the 9 today, we are now up to a staggering of 350 US Nobel laureates. And now, I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce some of the future Nobel Prize laureates as well, who are here with us today. Last night, we had an event here in the House of Sweden celebrating 6 young finalists in this year's Challenge Your Perspectives competition. They've come from all over the country, and to find out whom of them would actually be getting a full tuition-free waiver for a master's program at the Stockholm or Lund universities in Sweden. They have endured a very tough competition, and there's been hundreds of other American university students in this competition over the past few months. The finalists were, for the master's program at Lund University, Stephanie Dale from the New York University, who won the first prize, with Monica Ayala Talavera from University of Missouri, Columbia, and Grant Lafarge from George Washington University as the runners-up. And for the prize, the master's program at the Stockholm University, the winner was Ellie Johnston, University of North Carolina at Asheville, with Rebecca Burke, University of Idaho, and Timila Dakwa from Lake Forest College, Illinois, as the runners-up. I'd like to ask you to stand up, and let's greet also these wonderful people with a round of applause. We wish all of you the best success in the future. Now, for the 7th year in a row, Dr. Alan Leshner has agreed to moderate this discussion we have in front of us here. Dr. Leshner is the CEO for the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and he's the executive publisher for Science. And before joining the AAAS, Dr. Leshner had a long and distinguished career at the National Institute for Health, National Science Foundation, and in academia. But before handing over to you, Alan, I'd like to end by sharing with you a little comment from a third grader. Her teacher asked her to explain Sir Isaac Newton's first law of physics. And I frankly don't know if my kids would be able to answer the question. But this is the answer that this little girl gave. Bodies in motion remain in motion. Bodies at rest stay in bed unless their mothers call them to get up. And I think all of us here today are very, very happy that you actually got up when your mothers called on you to go to school. Dr. Leshner, the floor is yours.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Okay, this is going to be informal. We're delighted to have you here. This is a wonderful event. I look forward to it all year. Let's try that again. Good afternoon. Thank you very much. That's the most informal contact you're going to have over the next couple of weeks. Your Excellency, the Ambassador of Sweden, the Ambassador of Norway, thank you for having us here. And greetings, everybody. As I started to say, I really love this, and particularly I love it this year because we have a gaggle of Nobelists. Herding this gaggle should be a rather interesting challenge. This is one of my favorite buildings in Washington and unquestionably one of the best views. It can be very distracting, and therefore, if you don't mind, I suggest that everyone turn your head, in your case, to your right for just a minute, have a look at the view, and then don't be distracted by it. The second thing that I would mention at the outset is, first we're going to hear from each of the laureates a very brief comments about who they are and how they got here and a little bit about their work, all done in 3 minutes each. And then we'll open up the floor for questions from the audience. Now, I always feel compelled to define a question. A question is short, it doesn't have a preamble, doesn't resemble a speech, and your voice goes up at the end. Okay, got it? That makes you the questioner, and they will be the answerers, and I don't think they'll all feel compelled to answer all of the questions. Again, it's a wonderful pleasure to be in the presence of all 9 American Nobel laureates. It's a great honor for me to have this role of moderating, and I think it'll be a great pleasure for all of us. I will repeat the one thing that the ambassador said, and that is, let's try to keep it in English as opposed to scientese, and because the audience and certainly I will need that in order to understand. So if you don't mind, Dr. Rothman, can I impose on you to take just a couple of minutes and say who you are, how you got here, and a little bit about your work.
Thank you. Is my microphone on now? Well, I'd just like to start by thanking the ambassadors on behalf of all of the laureates for being such a fantastic host. Your staffs are really wonderful. It's been a great day. And also thanking all of you for coming today. So my name is James Rothman. I'm a professor at Yale University in the School of Medicine. I chair the Department of Cell Biology. And I work solved a very basic problem of physiology that has significant medical impact in respect to diseases like diabetes and a number of other chronic conditions. And as you know, the body is a very complex place, and we have different organ systems. For example, the brain, the liver, and so on. Each of these organ systems needs to be in sync with all the others throughout the body. They do this by communicating, by secreting molecules into the blood that provide information. This was a big mistake. I think I'll just talk without the microphone, which I'm very good at because I teach college students. What I've been trying to get across is that the various organ systems in the body need to communicate with each other to remain in sync. And that requires molecules that pass between them that signal the state of one organ to another. We call that endocrine physiology, the most famous. Be passed between tissues or within a tissue or within a cell. And I especially have been recognized for the work that we've done in the direction of these bubbles within the cell so that they know where to deliver their cargo and when to deliver their cargo.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Dr. Schekman.
Thank you, Alan, and thank you, Ambassador and friends. I want to take the opportunity to thank the country of Sweden for celebrating basic science. If you look on the stage today, you'll see there are 9 scientists who all started with a very fundamental question about how life works, or how the economy works or doesn't work. And we pursued that very often, though not always, with generous federal or private support, not because what we were doing was going to cure cancer or solve the world's problems, but because of an investment in a fundamental appreciation that knowledge itself can be applied. And I feel in a small way that I've had a success in that respect. I am a product of public education. I am a professor of molecular and cell biology at the University of California, Berkeley. In fact, my whole life essentially has been at the University of California, Berkeley. Before that, I was a student at UCLA and a postdoc at UC San Diego. And for 4 years, I fell off the rail and was a graduate student at Stanford. But nonetheless, my life has been made possible by an investment, I'd say a wise investment, of public dollars in education and in science. I began my career at Berkeley in 1976 with a simple question about how cells grow and divide, and I chose to study this problem in baker's yeast, not because of any notion that it would solve the problems of humanity, but because it was a simple organism in which one could probe using genetics and biochemistry the basic operation of a cell. All of the cells in our body, or essentially all of them, share with the lowly yeast an evolutionarily conserved pathway of protein secretion. Each of the cells in our body produce thousands of molecules, protein molecules. These are the little engines that catalyze the chemistry of life. And about 10% of those molecules are shipped out of the cell by an export pathway. And as Jim has said, they must be encapsulated in little carriers called vesicles and collected within the cell and then eventually deposited to the outside of the cell. So we began with a very simple idea that this would be essential for life in yeast. And with that idea, we decided to isolate mutations that block this pathway, imagining that the genes that would promote this export process would be intimately coupled to the growth and viability of a cell. That's as technical as I'll get to tell you that we were able to identify a few dozen different genes that are required for this pathway. And as we mapped these genes and their function with respect to each other, it became perfectly clear that lowly yeast uses the same process as human cells use to export their proteins. And at the same time, in the private sector, in a biotechnology company, it became obvious to use yeast as a vehicle for the expression and secretion of useful, medically useful proteins. Nothing that I would have done in my own lab, but what we learned set the stage for this. It was a natural transition from a public investment to a private investment, and as a result, and through my help with this company as a consultant, it became possible to manufacture human insulin by secretion in yeast. A company in Denmark, Novo Nordisk, now is the major supplier of human recombinant insulin in Europe. And now over 1/3 of the world's supply of human insulin is made by secretion in yeast. So some of you, if you're diabetic or no diabetics, may actually be using this product, which indirectly is a result of the very basic discoveries that my students were able to make at Berkeley. And so I think, just to summarize once again, this kind of investment in basic science is crucial, even if one has no idea, and I would say particularly if one has no idea how it may be applied, it inevitably will be applied in the private sector.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much. Dr. Südhof.
So I'm Thomas Südhof. I'm German by origin, which is obvious once you hear me speak. I came to the States 30 years ago as a postdoctoral fellow and became an immigrant. I performed most of the work that this prize was for when I was a professor at the University of Texas at Southwestern Medical Center at Dallas, although a significant part was also performed at Stanford, where I've been for the last almost 6 years. As an immigrant, I have to say that the public support of science, and especially a merit-based science system in the United States, has been crucial for what I did, and I think what many other people did. And I think that we need to maintain in this country this type of support that's completely based not on the direction of the science, but on its success, on how good it is and how well it holds up in future. In terms of my own work, I became interested when I was training as a medical doctor in neuronal diseases and brain diseases because there was absolutely no way to understand them. In fact, even to this date, we don't really understand much about how diseases such as schizophrenia or autism or Alzheimer's occur. And I started to study how neurons in the brain communicate with each other. And I was fascinated by the incredible speed and precision with which they talk to each other. And so I chose the problem early on trying to understand how a neuron can perform with this speed and precision the type of process that Professor Rothman and Professor Schekman referred to, which is the trafficking of these little bubbles or vesicles or whatever that allow a nerve cell upon being excitation, upon being stimulated, to quickly send out a signal. And that is a process that is orchestrated to an incredible degree locally at the point where neurons communicate with each other at synapses to perform what Professor Rothman already introduced as synaptic transmission. And I was interested in understanding how is this possible. And so over the two decades or so that we've worked on this problem, we have tried to specifically identify the mechanisms that underlie the ability of the neuron to secrete neurotransmitters, this chemical signal, with this high degree of speed and precision. And this is important, not only for understanding how the brain works, which I think in itself is a fascinating issue. But it is important in general for establishing a basis on which to build an understanding of different types of brain diseases, if I may call them that. Both of trying to understand neurodegenerative diseases, which are thought to initiate by a dysfunction of the same synapses, by a destruction, if you want, of the synapses that mediate this communication, and for understanding neuropsychiatric disorders such as autism and schizophrenia that we're becoming increasingly interested in, which may, although this is not clear completely, which may involve a sort of shift in this type of information processing, in this type of signaling between cells in the brain, in a way that doesn't allow an individual to actually process sensory information appropriately. And so I continue, obviously, to work on this problem, but I think that understanding how nerve cells communicate with each other in the brain is a fundamental prerequisite in order to make progress in understanding also the medical issues that build upon them. Thank you.
Thank you. That was terrific. Since I'm a neuroscientist myself, I'm particularly happy to hear their reports of what they've been doing and their implications. Okay, we're going to shift from physiology or medicine to our friends in chemistry, and we'll start with Dr. Karplus. Please.
One of the questions we were asked was, how did we get into science? And for me, it began very young. I like to observe the world around me. And I don't know how many of you went out on the porch and noticed that there were about 25 mallet ducks and 1 coot, which is rather rare around here. And as I went along from looking at birds, looking at little animals under the microscope, slowly I evolved from trying to sort of understand them. I did go up to Alaska to try to do research on how birds find their path on their migrations. Slowly I began to think, well, if one really wants to understand things, everything is made up of atoms and molecules. You have to know how they work. So I learned chemistry and physics, and finally ended up, because I wasn't a very good experimentalist, I did some experiments, I ended up in doing modeling of these complex systems, and that's what the Nobel Prize was given for, some certain advances in doing that. And rather than taking too much more time, because the idea of this, as I understand it, is that you people in the audience ask questions. I'll take as little time as possible, and namely just to say that the Nobel Committee stressed the interactions between the 3 of us when it gave the Nobel Prize. So I'll let the 2 others talk about the parts of it and save 2 minutes of my time for your questions.
Thank you. And thank you for your generosity. Please, Dr. Levitt.
I'd like to echo the thank yous to the ambassadors, to the audience, and especially to the people of Sweden, and to Martin too for giving me an extra seconds that I probably won't use. I think that what is very
Giving the audience a few seconds.
I'm kidding.
not
I know.
you.
I know. I'm taking advantage.
I was going to repeat that. Thank you, Dr.
Right.
Karplus.
I've already used up those few seconds. So in any case, I think that what is rather unusual about the prize that the 3 of us got is that it is the first prize in a whole new direction of research where experimental work is complemented by computational work. Computers are used in many aspects of the life around us. Today was meant to be rainy. That simulation they got wrong. So that was a computer calculation. We pioneered computer calculations on the large chemical molecules that were talked about by the winners in medicine. And this has opened up a whole new field in which computers become very equal partners with experiment. And I think given that computers have developed by almost 1 billion-fold since we started this work 45 years ago, over the next 50 years, computers will become more and more important, and more science will be done by simulation and by interpretation of experiment. Just a few words about science funding. A huge change in the last 30 years has been that people under 40 get almost no money, and people over 65 get lots of money. And it seems to me that this is something which is here, and that is a very bad idea, because everyone here will agree that we made our discoveries when we were under 40. And I think that we're going to have to do something about that, and this is going to be a real challenge, given that the people over 65 have all the power nowadays. So this is going to be an interesting issue. I'm going to stop there and hand over to Arieh.
I suspect we'll come back to that issue, which is a very important one. Thank you for raising it. Dr. Warshel.
Okay, so first I think that the research here might make the time that older people could be productive longer. But ignoring this risk, one of the example of what we done in the research in how computer could augment experiment is asking how enzymes, which are the molecules that do everything in your body and make chemistry much, much faster than what it is in the lab, how this happens. So this fundamental question is example to a question that has been around for a long time and in my view could never be solved experimentally. It's like looking at a watch and trying to see how it moves, but not really being able to figure out what happened. And this is something that computer allow you to do by going into a model of an enzyme and asking what are the forces there, how it break, let's say, a sugar molecule so fast. And this is something which happened some times ago, but now it starts to be a paradigm shift that actually using the computer to explain experiment rather than just to produce nice movies about experiment is a major new progress which is going to change science. I mean, you don't want to go too fast because there was just an article about people that prove by computers that God exists, and I don't think that this proof is real, but how proteins work, computers are going to explain. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, let's shift gears towards economic sciences. Let's start with Dr. Fama.
Okay. I think they made us go last because they were trying to intimidate us, but we don't intimidate that easily in economics.
We've heard about economists, so we...
So the statement of the prize was it was for empirical research in asset pricing. And my view of that is it contains two major areas that I've been working in for the last 50 years. One is the adjustment of stock prices, the adjustment of asset prices to new information, a simple market efficiency hypothesis which says that if markets are working properly, prices should reflect all available information. A trivial hypothesis to test, a much less to state, a much less trivial hypothesis to actually test. And I won't get into that, but that's basically the guts of it. And then the second half is really about models of risk. How do you measure risk, and what is the relation between expected return and risk in a well-functioning market? So I've spent maybe 2/3 of my work in asset pricing on that question, developing and testing basically models of risk and return. Now, I'll put in a little plug here. This is a finance prize. And in my view, finance is by far the most successful area of economics. All PhD students in economics have to be familiar with the basic paradigms in finance. There's no other area of economics in which there's such a rich interplay between theory and empirical work, and there's no other area of economics that has made such penetration into everyday financial life. Basically, the finance industry as it exists today developed on the heels of the work that was done by people starting in the middle 50s up until this day. So I'm proud of this prize, and I'm glad we got it.
You know, there's an old saying, let science replace ideology, intuition, and common sense as the basis for how we approach whichever specific problem. I think you've just articulated that terrifically for us. Thank you. Dr. Hansen.
So, like others, I'd really like to thank you for the opportunity to speak here and thank the two ambassadors for hosting this event. Let me take a little bit of a step back. We were asked to give some indication of how we got to where we were. I was a troublemaker as a high school student, and I didn't do very well. I was very lucky that my father was a provost of a university and could actually get me into a university, so I was able to get into a university. That was good. That was a good university, too, so I was able to exploit that. But then what was really key to me was teachers. I had teachers at university that really helped me make a transition from being this somewhat awkward high school student to eventually launching a research career that I'm quite proud of. And if you think about the importance of teaching, and especially for me at the college level, it's just absolutely critical. There's I can identify 4 different mentors that really helped me get from one place to another, and without their help, it just wouldn't have happened. My own areas of research, I came into economics as a macroeconomist and a statistician, doing stuff related to time series econometrics, and then, like Gene said, economics involves financial and finance. There's really critical linkages there, and I became very interested in the linkages between macroeconomics and financial markets. So what's the interplay between them? What are what do financial markets have to say about the macroeconomy, and kind of vice versa? I came at this also as a statistician, and so I had a strong background in statistics. And so the challenge to me was the following. You've got a rather complicated economic system that has financial markets, it's got interplay between the macroeconomy, and there's underlying fundamental uncertainty, and there's uncertainty about and kind of how is that captured and reflected, and how can we go about analyzing models when it has all these different complexities. Of course, that full challenge I quickly learned was I quickly figured out was way too complicated. And so the trick for a statistician was to figure out how to study linkages between the macroeconomy and financial markets without having full-blown models of everything that had to work. And so I was lucky to develop some statistical methods that other people have picked up and applied as well. That's been applied to this kind of linkages between the macroeconomy and financial markets. Now, in truth, a lot of the early work in this area was more at, statisticians don't always bear good news. So the statistician in me was documenting puzzles with models, and not just why models are good, but actually what their failings were. But for me, that's a very important part of the scientific advances, because once you can figure out what's wrong with models, and that sets the next stage for how to fix them and make them better and the like. And so that's those type of interests have kind of guided my career, and they've guided my research. Thank you.
That, by the way, was not a signal.
Okay.
Dr. Shiller, please.
Well, my 2 colleagues here are from the University of Chicago, a bastion of free market theory, and I'm from Yale University. I'm a little bit different from them, but I like to emphasize there's a lot more similarities. We're all interested in the same phenomena and using rather similar techniques to study it. So like my 2 co-prize winners, I'm interested in how asset prices move and how that relates to the economy. In fact, we've written parallel papers that almost look alike, Lars and I. On the other hand, I married a psychologist, and I've learned this. Ginny sitting here. I have learned. I've had the impulse to broaden the scope of our research, and so I've been working with behavioral finance people who bring psychology and sociology into the profession. I'm interested in things like, how do we understand this financial crisis, and do we have to learn from the experience that something I wrote a book called Irrational Exuberance, which you would not have used as a title, probably. Maybe you would. But I've been interested also in changing the system. The system, unfortunately, involves bad feedback loops. Now, we've just observed that happening several times with the microphone in this room. You know what a feedback loop is. And the feedback loops in economics go at many different levels. What I've been trying to do with my research is to try to get financial institutions changed so that they don't support bad feedback loops in the future. And I've done things like create home price indices. The Standard & Poor Case-Shiller home price indices you might have heard of, but it was designed to be used by finance. I wanted this to be part of a system that protects us against the kinds of market failures we've seen. I'll stop with that.
So this is great, and actually you've raised a number of issues that actually characterize the whole scientific enterprise independently of your disciplines, and if there's a lull, I warn you, I'll delve into that stuff. But we're going to turn to the audience. Just a couple of ground rules, if you don't mind, a couple more ground rules. I'm only a little controlling. Please don't ask the economists about individual stocks that you're worried about. Their work is at a higher order of aggregation. And those of you who would like to ask the physiology or medicine people about your siblings' particular illnesses, could you go to them later? The chemists will hold up labs over there. Later, most of them based with computers, so good luck. With that, we have some microphones. There's a microphone. If you would raise your hand, I would ask that you, first of all, say who you are, from whence you come. You don't have to give a whole long thing about from whence you come, just a short version. And then if you would state your question succinctly, we'll try to get relatively succinct answers. You had your hand up first, I think. Sure.
I'm Lucy Mannheim, a retired, it's hard, a retired federal geologist. I would like to ask Professor Südhof a question. If the speed of transfer of information between neurons, especially in the motor cortex, is slower than you expect, do you think it could be speeded up by external application of benign lasers?
Okay. We told them we were preparing them, and the King of Sweden had a similar question, and we decided that we'd let one of our attendees here ask it first. Yes?
I think the question aims at a very important issue, which is how is the communication between nerve cells in the brain modulated? How is it changed? And the speed is almost never changed, or only marginally so. But what is changed is the magnitude. And that change in magnitude of the transmission signal has a tremendous importance, for example, in learning and memory, and probably other behavioral activities as well. So I understand your questions correctly. Yeah, absolutely. It's very important that this process of synaptic transmission is regulated not only whether or not it occurs, but also what the size of it is. And that is a central issue that we are trying to understand as a field, and that has great importance for understanding human behavior.
Okay, let's go over to the back there, if we have the microphone. Sir?
My name is Dr. Granville Sawyer. I'm professor of finance at Bowie State University in Bowie, Maryland. I'm going to direct my question to the economist, needless to say. In light of the Dow hitting record highs in the midst of an economic slump, Dr. Krugman's recent article that this economic slump may be the new normal, and developments in behavioral economics and behavioral finance, a simple question: are efficient markets still efficient?
Of course.
That's a real simple question. It was short. Whether it was simple, I don't know. Please.
No. I think stock prices are high. Earnings have been very high. The market is saying they're probably going to stay pretty high for a long time. I don't know any more about it than that. And I don't really speculate about the future. I'm an empiricist. I deal with data, and I try to read what the past has told us. But basically what it's told us is you can't predict the future. So,
Please, go ahead.
This would be a good occasion to congratulate Professor Fama for being one of the most successful at beating the market with his dimensional fund advisors.
Wait a minute. Can we find out a little more? I'm sorry.
No, I think that the markets are somewhat efficient. It's a half-truth, personally.
What does it mean for the markets to be efficient? Sorry.
Well, this
for
is the man who
translation.
coined the term, I believe, in the 60s. I'll let him define it.
prices reflect all available information.
I like that, I think. And the answer is yes, it is efficient, the markets?
All of the tests that have been done say that if we look at how prices respond to announcements of events, the response is very quick. When we had monthly data, it was well within a month. When we got daily data, it was well within a day. Now we have transaction-to-transaction data. It looks like it's a matter of minutes before prices adjust. Now, that part of it is pretty clear. Another part of it is pretty clear. An implication of this model is that if you give people your money and they tell you they're going to beat markets in particular ways by choosing stocks or whatever, you're probably going to waste a lot of money paying them fees for things that they can't really do, because the empirical record is quite clear that passive investing works much better than active investing. But the downside of active investing is they charge you a lot to let you do it.
Yes, Dr. Karplus, please. Sure, absolutely.
Look at how the stock market fluctuates over the last 6 months. It keeps going up and down like that. Now, obviously, these are short-term fluctuations where people don't know that one day something happens in the government and the stock market goes down by 200 points. 2 days later, it goes up by 300 points. So there's obviously some instability built into the stock market that if people were able to calculate it, they would get very rich. But my impression is very few people are able to do that. So what understanding of the stock market do you really have, if one wants to call it a science, if there are these? I don't invest very much, but I see these fluctuations. They're just unbelievable. They make zero sense to me. Maybe they make sense to you, and so it's a very unstable system.
The empirical implication of your statement is that the variance of price changes over multiple days should be less than the multiple of the variance over a day. That's what you mean when you say prices are violated.
But
that's not true. It's not true. So your presumption was factually incorrect.
Well, if you plot it,
I like it.
I would be
I like
willing
it.
to
This is
challenge
getting
you.
good. I am going to cut it off, but good. Thank you. All right, back to the audience. Yes, please.
My name's John Frim. I'm the First Secretary for Defense Research at the other lovely embassy in Washington, the Embassy of Canada. A little bit of preamble. I did my graduate work in cryobiology. And when we froze the cells in liquid nitrogen, essentially we think life stops, chemical processes stop. And when we warm those cells, some are alive and some are not. And I'm wondering if your work gets close to what that spark of life is that determines whether a cell will in fact be alive or not be alive.
Yeah, guys.
Who's the lucky person?
Well, there are some cells that survive that kind of treatment easily. I mean, yeast cells are perfectly content to be frozen in liquid nitrogen and then will resuscitate virtually completely intact. But more complicated organisms with multicellular organisms do not survive, often because of ice damage to the cells themselves. So an active field of inquiry is cryoprotection, to find a suitable chemical composition or matrix that would allow cells in a tissue to survive. And I think there are examples now where mice can be chilled, not frozen, but chilled to a very low temperature and will survive. And it's sort of an empirical effort to identify the right medium in which to suspend them at low temperature. So I don't know that there's a spark of life, as you refer to it. I think life can persist or not be damaged by being frozen. It's just a question of finding the conditions that preserve cells or tissue to keep from the damage of the freezing event.
Can I make a comment?
Sure, please.
I just would like to add to that, because the question comes to a very, very fundamental point, which is what the nature of life is. I don't think there's anyone here, even the economists, who would have an opinion on that for sure. But after 40 years of being a biochemist, I've developed an opinion. And my opinion is that actually life is nothing more than a persistent, stable chemical state. So in other words, when a cell is frozen, if that state is not damaged, it can be resuscitated to the same original state. Much of the history of biochemistry, of which I'm a more recent contributor, has been all about reproducing in extracts of cells activities that were previously associated only with living cells. The founder of modern biochemistry, Edward Buchner, who won the Nobel Prize in 1907, discovered that the fermentation of alcohol, something of interest especially in the Nordic countries, does not require Randy's yeast cells even to live. It will occur in extracts of the yeast cells. This came soon short on the heels of Pasteur's discovery that life could only come from life, and it forever dispelled vitalism. It started a culture of discovery, which continues today, in which we come to appreciate, as we get deeper into life, more and more that it is life consists of a large number of linked chemical reactions that have a reinforced feedback behavior that leads to a stable and a persistent state. There are, of course, many other views about life that that are probably worth discussing, but I think a pure hard scientist view of life is the one that I've just described.
Or it may reflect the limit to what science can say about life. There goes the other perspective.
I personally don't think there is any limit.
Okay, we'll talk later. Please. Wait. Who are you?
Dr. Rothman.
No, say who you are.
Oh, sorry, I'm Uri Hirschberg.
Dr. Rothman, you're more than welcome.
Sorry, I'm Uri Hirschberg. I'm coming here from Philadelphia, and
sorry. I come from Philadelphia.
Actually, I'm sorry for both of you.
Go Eagles. Anyway, my question is, wouldn't you say that a better definition would be that it's an unstable, persistent state? Because what you're freezing that and then maintains itself is not that one state. It's constantly unstable but persistent.
Well, okay, this is something we should discuss after. It's a very technical point. And I'll be happy to discuss it with you after.
Okay. In the back, please. Yep, you who are looking around, ma'am. Yeah, good. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. This is a question directed at our economists, laureates. My name is Gina Lai. I work at the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, and my work centers around the supervision of financial institutions that are designated as systemically significant. I know that Professor Hansen has commented on the limits of systemic risk as it is, and there's obviously a lot of data out there, but the usage of this data and this type of approach is quite early. But I wanted to see what the three of you had to say, or any sort of advice you had to policymakers who have taken up the task of monitoring and mitigating systemic risk. Thank you very much.
So I guess, as you know, there's economists since the financial crisis, have rushed to give various different measures of systemic risk. And my own take on this is they've rushed to give measurements without giving defenses, coherent defenses for the measurements. But you know,
Could I interrupt you? Could you just say what systemic risk is?
You know, here's a good question. So that's a wonderful question. Systemic risk is something like Potter Stewart, when he talked about pornography, you know it when you see it. and that's pretty much the economist's definition. That's pretty much the definition of it now, which is part of the problem. How do you measure something until you have a fully coherent model of what it is you're measuring? Governmental oversight agencies they face a tremendous challenge now because they have legislation that's telling them that to go and try to monitor stuff like systemic risk that we don't fully understand yet. So I think, to me, part of the problem is the legislative pressures that have been put on organizations like the one what you're involved in. And I think the best hope of financial oversight in the short run is that the people doing the oversight are given very simple and transparent things to be looking at, and not base it on ill-defined concepts that open the door to discretionary policies.
Yeah, please.
When AIG was failing, it was pointed out that they have contracts, financial contracts with maybe hundreds or thousands of other institutions. And if you let AIG fail, they'll all fail. That's systemic risk because one side of the contract is going bankrupt, and so it just feeds through the whole system. So the Dodd-Frank Act wanted to address this, and they created the Office of Financial Research, which will collect data on all these interconnections. And it's 3 years now. The OFR is started, but it's turning out to be a huge project. As Lars was saying, you've got to conceptualize things, you've got to subpoena to get the data, and I'm understanding that it's not that far along yet. But in past crises, the crisis has launched decades-long inquiries in economics. So the Great Depression launched something that you've heard of called GDP and the unemployment rate. These things weren't measured before. And so I think we have to go on another course of research that will take many years, and I think it will help improve government policy toward this systemic risk.
I would certainly echo that.
So I think systemic is whatever the government says is systemic the next time we have a crisis. And all of the research we do up until then will be totally irrelevant. But the big problem that arose was that these financial institutions didn't have enough equity capital to cover their losses. So this wouldn't be a complete solution. There is no complete solution. But the first order thing to do would be to require that they jack up their equity capital way more than anybody has talked about. So my simple statement would be, tell me how much they should have had so that they wouldn't have failed in that crisis, and then add 10% to that. And that's a good place to start. But you'll have to watch them still, because they're very clever at getting around these things.
Well, locking up that kind of money would be hard for
Whoa. Now you're on weak ground here.
Okay. In that case, I withdraw the offhand remark.
That's one of the worst fallacies in all this discussion, actually. Want me to explain it?
It's expensive to use money?
It doesn't freeze. What determines the value of something is the asset side of the balance sheet. The amount of debt that's financed with equity, that's not put aside. That's financing assets on the other side. And then you have debt that's also financing asset on the other. So this statement that if they have to have more equity, that means they're going to put this aside. No, doesn't happen that way. It gets invested in stuff.
Good. Go ahead.
My name is Bob Kelly, and I've been in the State Department. I noticed, this is a question to the chemistry winners. I noticed that you all were born in other countries. Why did you come to the United States, and how did you come here?
Well, I guess to begin with, sort of the question begins, why did I leave Austria where I was born? And the obvious reason was because the Nazis were invited into Austria, and being a Jew in Austria in those days meant that you probably wouldn't survive. My parents were lucky enough to be aware of this, and so we left Austria in time, and then there's a question, where do you go? And it turned out that I had an uncle who already lived in the United States. He worked for a company, Eastman was the head of the company and also the name of the company. And in those days, in order for a refugee to be allowed into the United States, you had to have an affidavit, which just meant that somebody guaranteed that you wouldn't become a ward of the state. Well, my uncle's boss gave us this, and that permitted us to come here. And he lived in Belmont in the neighborhood of Boston, and that's where we went. And I don't know whether that's a full answer to your question. I'll let the others talk.
It's to the advantage of the United States that you all came.
Well, I mean, that's, of course, something that many people have said, and President Obama said it also today, that the immigrants have made a tremendous contribution to the United States. And in fact, if you go back and take older individuals who were outstanding scientists, not only Einstein, but people like him, they all came to the United States. And there's no question in my mind, maybe the economists can prove me wrong, that the exodus of scientists from Europe is what started the present day conditions in the United States where science is doing so well, as has already been discussed, the number of Nobel Prizes and all that. So it's the people who came here, who brought their knowledge, that started this scientific enterprise. There were a few people like J. Willard Gibbs and such who were actually Americans in those days. But overall, I think that that's been a very important part in what we have today. And the important thing is to keep it going. And as other people have said, to supply enough money so it can keep going.
So I guess unlike Martin, I came to the USA after being a citizen of 3 other countries. I was born in South Africa, left there when I was 16 to study in England, had an academic position in England for about 10 years, and then moved to Israel. Had an academic position having lots of parties from different embassies. I came here in in 87, and the prima facie reason was that this was when HIV/AIDS was becoming a real problem. I had a friend who was working at NIH, essentially giving out money, and he sort of spoke to my wife about how important it would be if I went to the United States. So since she made all the decisions, I came to the United States. I think more broadly than that, I've now been at Stanford for 27 years. It's an amazing place to be. I just love being there. And then to speak to the more general question of judging how important immigration has been, let's just say for Nobel Prizes as a simple indicator, a few days, almost like an economist, and I went through all the tables of all the Nobel Prize winners and counted up how many for each country had been born in that country versus how many got medals for that country. And the USA has a surplus of about 35%. So about 100 of the US Nobel Prize winners over the last 100 years were not born in the USA. The next best country is Switzerland with a surplus of about 12%. And it's a very small number because they didn't get so many Nobel Prizes. And then Great Britain. And almost every other country in the world has a balance of trade deficit in terms of Nobel Prizes. So it is kind of interesting.
Interesting. Dr. Warshel.
In my case, I grew up in Israel, and I came back to the Weizmann Institute. I have some difficulty in getting permanent job, and I moved to the United States. So this is another form of decision being made by others.
That's sort of interesting. Since I know the president of the Weizmann Institute, I think you should write him a little note that says,
It's okay. We had exchange.
Okay, let's go back to the audience. Yes, please.
Hi there, I'm Michael Halpern with the Center for Science and Democracy at the Union of Concerned Scientists. Heard a couple of you talk about funding a little bit earlier. I'm wondering if any of you have anything to say, any thoughts about the impact of the sequester or the recent government shutdown on U.S. science, or more generally the link between functioning democracy and a thriving federal scientific enterprise.
So let me address that very directly, because in some ways, this is a funny story because it ends very differently from the way it begins. I had a grant from the NIH that was being reconsidered, and it is almost certain that that money was not received because of the sequester. The trouble is it was the best thing that ever happened to me. So it's really hard to complain about that. I think, again, as I said before, that the real problem is not what happens to people who are very senior in their scientific career. They can get money from their own institution, from private institutions. The real problem are the young people, people between 30 and 40, who need to be able to get money independently from the government. And for example, in NIH, the number of people less than 40 who get an NIH grant nowadays has gone to zero. This is a massive change of what it was 25 years ago. This is a really serious problem. But I think that the sequester, had effects. I don't think it's fair to basically isolate one particular thing. I think much scary is just a general downfunding of science in the U.S.
So Dr. Schekman made the first indication, then Dr. Südhof.
Well, I will say that the sequester has been an unmitigated disaster. There may be some exceptions to that, but I think generally people will appreciate that it's done a great disservice to science in this country. And I can give you specific examples. We've already discussed about what a wonderful country this is that has recruited great scholars to come here because of the entrepreneurial spirit of our science. In fact, I can add to that by pointing out that the membership of the National Academy of Sciences, which is a very high criterion for scientific excellence, is fully 1/3 populated by domestic members of the Academy who came from abroad, who studied abroad and came to the U.S. because of the opportunities here. And now we are systematically disinvesting in that scholarship, and we are seeing, it's not just in prospect, but we are seeing people return to their countries because of the funding problems here. I can cite specific examples from my own institution, scholars from Europe, scholars from Asia, who came because of the opportunities here, but who are now returning to their countries because those countries, unlike ours, see the promise of investment in basic science. So it's not just in prospect, it's actual damage that is occurring right now.
Dr. Südhof.
I would like to sort of expand, but also express a slightly different opinion, which is that I think that the sequester is an enormous danger, poses enormous danger to science, progress, to research. But I think, in fact, the biggest potential danger is not the very young people, not the ones under 40. It's sort of the mid-career, the people 40 to 50, who have been successful and who need the grants to continue to be successful. And they have the most problems of getting funded and maintaining an active research lab and not spending all their time writing grants, and which is rather unproductive because you don't really spend the time on doing research. And it's also those that I believe we are losing. The ones who are really successful and who show promise and then can get good jobs someplace else and are leaving the country. And I think that there is a lot of means for very young, for starting people to get funding and startups, and things are much better than they used to be, and most startups are big enough these days so they can sustain you for several years. It's the time when people have done something great and they're doing well and they want to renew their grant, and they want to get a second grant or a third grant, which they need to really do their science, and then the sequester comes and they can't get the money and they have to shrink down and they have to spend all their time on writing grants, and they may even have to raise their salary from grants. This is where the real problem is and where we are potentially losing a generation, because these people are getting out of the system. And then we can discuss about where the biggest issues are. But
I'll go to Dr. Rothman and then over to our economists.
I'd like to echo a couple of those points and add something to it. As bad, I think what we have in common is that among all these comments is that it's bad for people of all ages. Okay, it's bad. But what I'd like to say is, as bad as the sequester is, I regard it as a noise level problem. It's going to go away at some point. There's an underlying problem which is much more profound, which is the budget of the NIH has actually declined in purchasing power about 28% over the last 7 or 8 years. In addition, there are much more of this. There's much more spending within the NIH. We have actually a lot of money in the NIH budget, but more and more of it is going to projects that are essentially predetermined by the government through one route or another, sort of top-down science, bureaucrat-driven science, to put it in somewhat more pejorative terms. I doubt very much that in today's environment, I would have been able to do the work I did in the early 5 or 10 years that led to my sitting here today, and more importantly, to the discoveries that resulted from it. Echoing what Randy said, I actually advise my students not to stay in the United States. I tell them, please, you'll be good for a year or two, but on your startup package. But you really, if you want to do something that's not incremental, but rather is really a projective into the future and fundamental, you should go to any of the countries that were mentioned before. And I have to say, frankly, if I were 10 years younger, that's exactly what I would do. And this is sort of a shocking thing to come from someone. Now, one last point I'd like to make is that both of my colleagues, though they have been supported by the NIH, have received much more of their support in the long term from private sources, namely the Howard Hughes Medical Institutes. In fact, the majority of the Nobel Prize winners, at least in physiology and medicine, over the last many years, have almost without an exception been supported throughout their careers by the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. With that, the point of making this, emphasizing that point, is not to in any way criticize anybody or anything, but to point out that this problem of federal funding of basic research, it's not like it's happened overnight. It's happened over many, many years, certainly since the beginning of our careers. And it's been masked to some extent by very powerful and crucially important private institutions like the Howard Hughes Medical Institutes here, the Wellcome Trust in the United Kingdom, that have made it somehow a little easier for government to do whatever it's doing and somehow fall a little behind, a little bit, by little bit, by little bit. But that's accumulated to the point where it can no longer be made up, even by the most generous private sources. And we now have to turn back to the government and say, are you going to allow this country to decline as rapidly as it could? You know, the decline in Europe, 50 years of absolute world leadership in chemistry, physics, medicine, okay, biochemistry, went away in 5 years. It took 50 years to rebuild, okay? We are absolutely as vulnerable today. It won't happen in 5 years through a dramatic event like the rise of the Nazis, but we are really at a danger point right now.
Dr. Fama, then Dr. Shiller, and then Dr. Karplus.
I'll play my role as the town curmudgeon. As an economist, I'd say the real question is what's the optimal amount of funding for science, and whether it should be done publicly or privately. I'm not talking to my friends here, but when you hear economists talk about it, the optimal number that they come up with is basically infinity, and that's not the right number. And then there's the split between the public and the private. So the more public money that gets put in, the less private money will get put in, because public money deters private money. If we take an example, the European educational system is entirely public. As a consequence, research is dead in European universities, at least in economics. At least in economics.
Not a science.
And I don't
feel about it. Don't hold back.
No, it's not a feeling. For example, I've worked with General Electric Company in their research division for 10 years. And I understand and have taken part in their budget-making decisions. They will never do basic research. They should never do basic research. This is uniquely the responsibility, as the President of the United States himself said to us today, of the public.
Well, the question is, how much do you trust the public to make the right decisions on allocations? Well, look.
No, I actually think, Professor.
Let me tell you a story. So Warren Buffett
You
was
like
asked,
this or
why
should
why
I-
did he give his philanthropy to Bill Gates? Warren Buffett was asked, why did he give his philanthropy to Bill Gates rather than just giving it to the government? And he said, because Bill Gates will allocate it better. And I think there's a lot to be said for that. So it isn't a matter of GE just doing the research. Lots of institutes get funded by private philanthropy, not commercial money, but philanthropic money. I know because I have a research center that got funded by private money.
So Dr. Shiller, go ahead.
Well, basic research is a public good that won't be supplied by the private sector. The important thing is that scientists share freely. They don't keep secrets. That's what government funding. Now, I'm from Yale. He's from Chicago. All right? I'm going to say.
That's the second time you mentioned that.
Right. I'm going to say nobody has ever mentioned the word taxes. So I want to be direct about it. We need to raise taxes. And it doesn't have to be that much even to double the budget of the NIH and the NSF. That's what it has to. We're not going to take it out of food stamps. We're not going to take it out of public school teachers. We should raise taxes, and it won't hurt that much because it will stimulate the economy as well. So everything, that's what we have to do.
Okay, Dr. Karplus and then Dr. Hansen.
Say one thing about the sequester. I think where it's much more important than in science is in the rest of the people in the United States and the functions that the government should be able to do and is prevented from doing. I think I would. Boy, that was a bad.
We didn't, that wasn't a threat. Go ahead.
And I think that's the important part of the sequester. It has a small effect on science, but really we'll get over this with various types of funding. But the funding is being lowered, as was pointed out, is a much more general thing, and the sequester is a small perturbation.
Dr. Hansen.
I'm from Chicago. I think that means that Bob knows what I'm going to say, but I kind of suspect he really doesn't. So anyway, I actually believe in in government funding of basic research. I do agree the amount is absolutely critical, and the amount should not be infinite. My own experience in getting government resources, though, is that NSF gets responsive to political pressures, and what happens is basic research money gets pulled away from basic research, and it goes into directed projects that are often inefficient. And so I think it's very, very important that if you're going to argue for basic research, that you also put in place the political type of setup that will allow the money to actually go to basic research. And I think that's a critical part of it, because there's no point throwing more money at it if you don't allocate it wisely. And so, so certainly at the same time, I think you have to be thinking about that. I'm not willing to run out and say we should just increase taxes immediately to do this. I think there's hard decisions as a society we have to make in terms of kind of where we want to cut government programs and where we want to maintain them. We're facing very hard fiscal challenges going forward. We're not going to be able to support everything that we think right now, and the federal government's ducking and state governments are ducking very important fiscal challenges. So at the same time we're arguing for more basic research, we have to understand how this fits into a much broader challenge of long-term fiscal solvency.
Let's go back to the audience. Go ahead.
Frank Mannheim, former ocean and earth scientist, now at George Mason University School of Public Policy. My question is to Dr. Shiller. You mentioned that major institutions in the U.S. are following some bad leads, some flawed feedback loops. And am I right there? I'd like to ask whether you found some good clues or some interesting approaches to solve this problem, recognizing that the U.S. is a very mercurial place compared to other societies.
Well, this is a good chance for me to plug my book.
Called Mercurial Place?
I wrote a book in 2008 in the financial crisis called Subprime Solution. And in that book I gave a number of things that I would do that are fundamental changes. One of them is to revise our mortgage markets so that mortgages have workouts that are planned. During this crisis, we had 15 million households underwater. That means they were basically insolvent, and they weren't getting any help. So next time, we should have a plan, and the plan can be done by the private sector, but we have to encourage this so that mortgages have a plan for the next crisis. That's one example in my book, and that would have helped reduce the feedback. The feedback loop was home prices started falling. People said, we're out of money. We're in debt more than we own. Suddenly we can't get a home equity loan anymore, so we cut back our spending, and it puts the whole economy, that's a feedback loop, puts the whole economy in the tailspin. We can change our mortgage institutions that would wipe out that feedback loop.
Over here, please.
Good afternoon. My name is Stephanie Dale, and I'm one of the Challenger Perspective awardees. And I wanted to ask that I imagine after winning such a prize, you've had some time to reflect on your robust careers. So my question is, do any of you have any advice for those of us who are just beginning theirs?
Okay. Please.
Yeah, I thought about this. I would say the first thing is to be really passionate about what you do. Care about it and do it for yourself. Then be persistent. Don't give up if people tell you that it's not worth doing. If the first request is refused, write a second one. Assume the email went astray. Be polite, but be insistent. I think third, try to think for yourself. Really try to, be yourself and think for yourself. And finally, I think in life it's generally good to be kind, because you never know when it's going to come in useful.
Or, in contrast, when they could hurt you. Yeah, please, Randy.
I would add to that. When you consider your own independent career, if you have the opportunity to do that, you should formulate a big picture and keep your eye on that big picture and not be frustrated by the constant failures of science. You really, to be a research scientist, you have to be able to deal with the day-to-day frustrations of things not working. And you can't succeed unless you have in mind a big question and something that you strive for and something that will overcome that daily frustrations of life, and particularly of an experimental life.
Dr. Rothman.
I would agree with everything that's been said, but layer on top of it, and this is somewhat cynical, but I really mean it, don't listen to anybody, including these guys, okay? Listen to yourself, okay? Because that's what they did, and it paid off.
So I have a question that I want to throw in just for a minute, because it's been alluded to in a couple of your comments. And one of the trends in American science is that it's getting, or it has gotten rather difficult for what's called high risk, high payoff, or transformative research to get funded. If you had to do it now, would your work be funded in the current climate, or did you have to persist with some heretical view when you started out in order to get where you are? One of the controversies is that although peer review is a wonderful mechanism for choosing grants, it is rather conservative in nature. And as I at least heard you speaking, I kept hearing about rather non-conservative approaches that you took. Do you have any message that we should take from that? Yeah.
So this is a subject that is often discussed, obviously. And the problem is that a lot of the so-called high-risk, high-reward projects that I at least encounter, I would never fund, because I think they would better be called high-risk, high-reward, no chance. And so the way to solve this problem, because you do want to do transformative, you want to support transformative research, I think is to pay more attention to funding people instead of projects. Because anybody can come up with some crazy project and just send it in there to get money. That's easy. What's difficult is to judge which of these crazy projects is actually crazy and has a chance of success, instead of being crazy and having no chance of success. And It's very, very difficult to judge that based on, for example, all these transformative or Eureka grants that we now all submit, because there's not enough information. So I think that the way to deal with this, the best way would be to basically look at the people and fund people more and put more on young and middle-aged or whatever people's track records and what they've done and how successful they've been in doing new things in the past, as a student even, in order to give them money for the future.
I couldn't agree with that more. And I think that there is a way to do it. We already actually do that. In a university, when we hire someone, a young scientist, to start their own independent laboratory, we use our private philanthropy to support the startup of that lab. The numbers involved are anywhere from typically $1 million to several $1 million that are invested locally, okay, by departments that have really vetted these people very carefully. We interview our candidates involving groups of 10 or more candidates, lots of faculty interviews, lots of discussion about the research plans. They give lots of seminars. A lot of time and effort goes into this, as compared to an NIH review process, which is at a distance, impersonal, the candidate isn't met, and it's only what's written on a piece of paper. We have, in a way, a Faustian deal with government. You know, we want the money from the government. We think that's the responsibility, but it's inevitably connected to politics. If the government were to simply match the local investment in some formula that is made in an individual candidate, we would be investing 100% in people, and we would remove the political influence at a high level, and place the responsibility, I think, where it belongs for young scientists. There is no way for the government to know a young scientist. Only people who have worked and know that person can know the young scientist. And when they're investing their own money, they have skin in the game. And so they're prepared to take the risk, and so why shouldn't the government be?
I think on that note, I just looked at my watch. We're just about at the magic moment. I've noticed that the shades have started to, on their own, come up, which is sort of emblematic, I think, of something. I would like us, first of all, to thank our Nobel laureates for a wonderful afternoon. I hope we provided you with a little bit of practice into what you're going to experience when you get to Sweden shortly. I also want to thank Ambassador and Mrs. Learval and the staff of the House of Sweden, Ambassador Oss, for their hospitality and for inviting all of us into their home. So thank you very much. You get the last word.
And obviously we would like to thank you, Dr. Leshner, for guiding us through this extremely entertaining, informative, and very thought-provocative session. So thank you very much, Alan. If I may just ask you to remain seated for a few more minutes, I'd like to ask our laureates now to actually move out first, go down. You see Gabriella over here to the right. Go downstairs and you'll meet the media there for a few minutes. And for the media in the back of the room, I'd like you to meet with Larilyn over there. She's waving her hand. And to follow her downstairs, and we'll do the media interviews as we have planned. Well, depending on whether you will be public with your interviews or not, you know. But no, we'll take those off, I think, as you walk out of the room. So please, thank you once again for your contributions today. Wonderful to have you. So much, great. Please remain seated. I have one more message for the families of the laureates. Those of you who would wish to go back to the hotel immediately, there is a bus leaving at 4:40.